Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? My name is George Chacos. Good morning to all of you. I'm a board member of GIC and professor of finance and dean emeritus of Lebeau College of Business, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this conference that we have. This is the annual Monetary and Trade Conference of GIC. It's an annual event that we hold, and we really focus attention on economic matters. This year we have decided to focus attention on cybersecurity in the globally integrated world. And for those of you not familiar with GIC, we are a non-for-profit organization with particular emphasis on global economic matters. We provide a forum for discussing international trade, monetary and other issues that impact all of us. We believe in a fruitful and constructive dialogue, and we hold conferences not only here in Philadelphia, where is our office, which is located in the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, but also we offer conferences and discussions and panels in locations outside of the United States. Most recently, we hold a conference in Paris on central banking issues. We do have another conference coming up in Madrid, and I welcome you to join us on May 13, 14 on central banking issues that impact the European Union. And of course, we will be celebrating later on the 7th annual Rocky Mountain Economic Summit in July 10th in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that has been a cornerstone of our contributions in discussing monetary issues in the United States and internationally. And finally, I can share with you that we have an upcoming conference on energy matters, energy independence in the Western Hemisphere on November 5th in Philadelphia, and this is all I want to say about what we do as GIC as I try to promote the organization in different ways. I also want today to thank a couple of individuals that make this event to be with the organization and the support. And this is two individuals coming from the Lebeau College of Business. Lisa Bogan, she's not here, she's the assistant dean. And also Gavin, who organized the audio visuals and did all the setting. But I want to recognize also some of the board members that we have. Don Riesmiller is our chair of our programs, and he has worked very hard this year to develop a series of activities to enhance the goals of GIC. Peter Gold is our vice chair. Peter is somewhere here, and I think he's outside enjoying breakfast. Herb Taylor is a board member that has been with us for a number of years, and we appreciate his support with the Federal Reserve Bank. And I would say Peter Burns has been for many, many years a board member, but he decided to retire on me, I would say. But he is an emeritus board member for us, and he has assisted us in many ways. So as I begin, as I will introduce the first speaker, I would like to share with you some information that was a great surprise to me. As I read the papers every day, I realized that there is a number that stuck in my mind, and this has to do actually three numbers: 5, 50, and 500 billions. 5 billions, 50 billions, and 500 billions. 5 billions every year this is the number of funding for cybersecurity and, broadly speaking, security issues here in the United States. It's for entrepreneurship activity and venture capital activity. $5 billion is estimated every year to be the funding of cybersecurity-related investment on early stage, high risk, high return kind of projects or innovations. 50 billion is the amount of money that on an annual basis corporations invest for cybersecurity protection. And this is a number that has grown from 25 billion of 4 years ago. And the other number, the 500 billion, is the amount of money that we know, we have estimated based on various studies, on how much it costs for corporations when they are hacked, when there are cybersecurity breaches, etc. So if you look on 5 billion the investment on high risk, 50 billion the investments undertaken by major companies, and we don't know the small companies, to support cybersecurities and other infrastructure that they need to undertake to avoid surprises, and the 500 billion of associated damages or costs to the public, to the corporate sector, etc., then you understand that this is a huge industry, and it's something that requires more analysis and more understanding, because it's not a local or U.S. phenomenon. It's a phenomenon which has global implications. So, given the scope of activities, investments made, and the future projections of all these expenses, I thought that the cybersecurity conference that we have and the discussions that we have, they will provide enough light on what is the future, what are the trends, and what are the concerns that we face as we move forward in the next decade or so. The first speaker that we have, who will discuss some strategic perspectives on cybersecurity, is Joseph Ingmeni. He's a graduate from the United States Military Academy in 1997. He's involved with IBM, and he has worked in a variety of management and consulting positions for large and medium-sized enterprises. I would like to invite him to the podium, and he will be discussing with us matters related to strategic perspective of cybersecurity. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Please.
Oh, great. Let me I think we can advance here. So I can be pretty cognizant of time. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone, the board, the officers, the staff for putting this together. I think this is a great opportunity. I'm a big fan of the Independence Council. I think you guys bring a lot to the table. Great way to kind of get that knowledge shared. It's so important. So today I'm going to be talking about strategic cybersecurity. Now, a couple of caveats here. One is this is not a technical presentation, so I won't be getting into firewalls and this and that. If I do, it'll be very little. And secondly, the opinions expressed are strictly my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of IBM. So please, no one call Ginny Remedy and say I said this, and this is it. It's not corporate policy. So this is kind of what we're going to talk about today. Go through a little introduction of I'm going to put everything in context. Then we're going to talk about trends, motivations, and some innovations out there that create these likely targets. We're going to talk about the cyber attacker geography, which is really kind of the crux of the presentation. We're going to have some recommendations, maybe run through a quick case study, nothing boring. It's not a Harvard Business School case study. It's very basic. And then we'll do a quick conclusion, and I'll answer any questions. Okay, everybody remembers 9/11. Probably a lot of you may have actually been in New York or Washington, D.C. when it happened. Very obviously, can't say enough, very paradigm shift and tragic occasion for us. And when President Bush went and spoke before Congress, he said this: from this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor and support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. And that's critical. Now, I know that became very controversial about a year later but when we went into Iraq, but I think it does express a fundamental truth. And the truth is that when we're talking about traditional terrorism, for lack of a better word, or cybersecurity, people have to sit somewhere behind a computer. And while that somewhere could be anywhere, there's still a human being in a physical location doing something. And the argument I'm going to try and make is the places where those humans are operating, you're going to start to see trends of where they're operating out of, and that's what we have to take into consideration. A couple of other aspects we want to think about. Cybersecurity is a C-suite, C-level issue, and I know that's IBM does it too. All the other companies that market cybersecurity services, we like to say that. We like to say it's the CEO, the COO, all the top level guys have to worry about it. But it's not just, but there's a method behind that. It's not just marketing, although marketing plays into it. But it's not just marketing. It's a strategic risk for the enterprise and for the organization that CEOs have to be aware of, and they have to build their strategies with that into consideration. It's the managers and the decision makers that are going to drive the cybersecurity. By the time it comes to the IT department, we're kind of reacting. We're firefighters at that point. So it's about your risk management, and all of your mitigation controls should be built around those risks. One size does not fit all. So what works for company A is not going to work for company B. What works for Goldman Sachs is not going to work for a mom and pop store on the corner. So what is a cyber attack? I think this is this is kind of a controversial thing. It's a very ambiguous, like when we actually define it. A lot of people want to take a very narrow view, and that's legitimate. I think that even amongst our speakers, we couldn't agree on what's a cyber attack. I decided when I gave this presentation in November, I decided to take a very broad view. And this is the view, any effort to steal from, defraud, disrupt, or destroy personal enterprise-level operations through network systems or to maliciously cause a data breach. So that pretty much means anything. I mean, put another way is, this is a wide net I'm casting here. So what are the trends? I'm going to answer some of these questions. Where we are, where are we vulnerable, where are we going? This very high-tech graphic, I'm very proud of, though. As high-tech as it is. All of a sudden, is it me, but all of a sudden cybersecurity is in the news. I mean, we read every day. Maybe I just look for it, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Maybe I just see it more, but it's hitting the headlines. Everything, cybersecurity, started with the Target breach and everything. Well, part of it could be because that's the in-crisis report, but another thing I think is this. Past couple years, we've been really establishing the technology, outsourcing, enterprise-level systems, smartphones. We're all kind of adapting to them and integrating them. Well, now that we've got them there, now that the tree is planted, now we're starting to see all the issues around it, because we like to adapt and innovate, and that's great. Now we're starting to see all the security gaps. Now we're feeling the pain on this. So I think that's where we're in the present. But then we also have some innovations here that are that will drive future security gaps and vulnerabilities. Now, the best way, I was talking to a guy, he's about 24, he's actually a cadet at West Point. We're talking about Facebook. And he told his sister, are you going to get on Facebook? She's like, no, Facebook is passé. That's for grandparents. Grandparents go on Facebook. So, and I remember when Facebook got started. I was a grad student, so it's not that long ago. But the bottom line of innovations is, if you want to know what's going to be the next big thing, go talk to a 14-year-old, I think. I think that they're the drivers of a lot of the consumer technology. So let's talk about vulnerabilities. Why exploit a vulnerability? Well, it depends on the attacker's intent and their motivation and the type of information or data you have. There was that bank robber, Willie Sutton. And when they finally caught him, said, Willie, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where all the money is. So, why do hackers hack? Because that's where all the data is, and ultimately where all the money is. So let's talk about some motivations here. These are not technical. These are my terms I'm using because I just wanted to create some buckets to put these in. An integrity violation. That's more of a vandalism. That is to embarrass somebody, cause emotional distress, just to show that you're weak in your security, get some bragging rights. All right, what are some examples? Well, I could tell you one. Sony. That was a big integrity violation of Sony by North Korea. But what's interesting about Sony is it caused a huge profit loss, because in today's social media and networked environment, this one leak just cascaded. It was almost like a dirty bomb, and I'm not trying to poo-poo away nuclear annihilation. It was like a dirty bomb where it wasn't just the initial explosion. It was the residual radiation, and that's just really what hurt Sony. Then they went after Wikipedia, and then Sony's going to Wikipedia for spreading this information. It became a mess, and it hurt Sony. Another one that's interesting I want to highlight is the Syrian Electronic Army, which was with the Assad regime. I'll talk about them a little bit later, but they're big on putting out fake news leaks and hacking AP and hacking all these news outlets. Well, they put out a report that the president was shot. Dow dropped. And everyone scrambled to fix it. But so it's not just a little bit of embarrassment. It can cause monetary harm. Next one is for profit. So I want to steal your information. I want to make some money off of it. Credit cards, whatever. That's what we always think about. Target, Home Depot. But here's one's interesting. United Health and Community Health, when they got, you're seeing a lot of hacking, and actually it is by the Chinese, of medical records. Well, how do you make money off of medical records? Selling them? No one cares if someone's on Lipitor. How do you know what it is? And they've done research on this. China is trying to build up its strategic life sciences industry. And they don't have the basic data to get started. So to jumpstart, they're trying to steal all of our data to jumpstart, to get their life sciences to begin that research. So the best place to go is our healthcare records. There's a lot of cancer in certain areas of China because of pollution. So they're hacking cancer patients here so they can start doing the research, and they can come up with their own drugs and whatnot. So there's profit to be made, and I guess there's a twist way of saying it, in a lot of different things, and you'd be surprised.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Isn't it also, I'm led to believe anyway, that some of this data are being used to create synthetic identities? In other words, to be able to say you've got a credit card.
Exactly.
Now you get all this information.
Exactly.
Healthcare records, which includes a lot of them.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not saying, yeah, it's all of that profit motive. But I bring up the healthcare records with the cancer research because it's a more sophisticated scheme, I guess. Physical damage, and this is where they just want to destroy. And this is obviously what everybody worries about: crashing a drone into a chemical plant, something like that, or maybe a long-term weakening where they take our Joint Strike Fighter blueprints and use that to minimize our defenses. Pentagon, is constantly there's hacking attempts against the Pentagon, our military installations. Well, this is kind of it. So what are some of the innovations out there that, in that chart I did, what are the future innovations we're going to have to start dealing with and start looking at security gaps? And the first one really is the cloud. And cloud, you talk to 5 people, get 10 different answers what the cloud is, but I like to say it's infrastructure as service, where it's like those servers that we're basically renting. Linode is an example of a company like that. Platform as service, that would be like Amazon's platform. All these CRMs, those are all platforms that they develop from. An application, of course, anything on your smartphone, that's an example of that. There's public clouds that everybody can use. There's the private clouds within a company. And of course you have hybrids, probably like, I guess Amazon would be considered a hybrid cloud. Questions we answer that are always of a concern, is where is the data being stored? Who accesses the data? And, is it really, is it worth it? Is the whole of all this greater than the sum of the parts? The Internet of Things, sometimes I think this is just one of those terms we create. It's pretty much everything that's not a laptop or a desktop. So mobile devices, controllers. This is kind of interesting. Talk about being able to take technical data. I used to work for Johnson & Johnson as an electrical engineer, and my life I lived and died on and breathed and ate controllers on these pharmaceutical systems. And you could reverse engineer and figure out how to make things, how to make this pharmaceutical from getting into the controllers. Sensors, smart cities, things like that. UAVs, they're not called drones anymore, they're called UAVs because drones have Sidewinder missiles on them now. But UAVs are going to be everywhere. I think we kind of know that that's happening. Its technology has a physical impact. So that's a very inviting target on a lot of levels. Last one, which probably could be put in the Internet of Things, but I kind of want to highlight it because I think it's important. It's 3D printing. It's a form of manufacturing. I mean, usually manufacturing is taking a block of something and slicing it down into something, creating a lot of waste. This is taking drops of something and building it into a 3D product. I mean, it's a very crass way of explaining 3D printing. But what's interesting about this is it's going to revolutionize supply chains. As it gets better, we can start crunching supply chains, and we can have more smaller manufacturing all over closer to the source, rather than having these big industrial, humongous manufacturing in low-cost countries. And really that does two things. I mean, this creates two vulnerabilities. One, China's afraid of 3D printing. I mean, let's just put that out there. I mean, that could change, that changes China's business model. And then intellectual property becomes more valuable because now you don't have to keep inventories. You can make stuff on demand. So I'm not going to steal your inventory, but I'm going to try to steal your intellectual property. So I think 3D printing is going to pose a lot of issues. And then there's also been talk that you could sabotage a 3D printer and make it explode. So there's a physical aspect to it too. So, I mean, when you look at this, cloud, you may say cloud's vulnerable maybe to the integrity violations and profit. 3D printing, possibly all three. Internet of Things, definitely all three. I mean, it's very dangerous. It's especially with the physical damage. Again, messing with nuclear reactors, messing with things of national security. So let's talk about the bad actors in the cybersecurity realm. And remember when I said that cyber attackers, there's some trends of where they're at? Well, I mean, the first one is Russia. They are the #1 cyber bad guy, for lack of a better word. They actually have, their cyber command is almost the equivalent of ours. They attacked the Baltic a lot. They attacked the Baltic, Georgia war. I mean, who haven't they attacked? The Ukrainian prime minister. They've hacked the White House. They got the president's emails now. They're constantly attacking energy companies, Russian gangsters, 1.2 billion passwords. They're going after industrial control systems. I mean, China seems to get a lot of the headlines, but Russia is probably the worst. Very sophisticated. The next is China. You know, and like I said, you know, it's not as bad. It seems like China always plays the long game. You know, if you read Sun Tzu, it's not about that Western style attack. It's about that long game of wearing us down, which always seems to be happening. I mean, they have their PLA has their own cyber unit. They've been attacking since 2006. All the attacks match China's strategic priorities. That's why they wanted the Joint Strike Fighter. They wanted a lot of things, the industries they're building up. Now, in full disclosure, they deny the attacks. But we also see this group, Little Panda, which is believed to be backed by the Chinese government. They did the anthem and the community health. This is interesting. Great firewall, great fire, great cannon. China, and I just read this, I think, this morning or yesterday. I mean, China is intense in their monitoring of their internal internet. And they created this great firewall, which makes it impenetrable for outsiders to get into the Chinese internet unless the Chinese government wants you there. So a group created what was called Great Fire, which was ways to penetrate the Great Firewall. So this group came together. They were getting at the Chinese dissidents. This is how you penetrate the Great Firewall so I can get information out. So China created this thing called the Great Cannon, and it's basically a program, an application. The Great Cannon destroyed the Great Fire. What it did was it launched this attack on this website and just crushed the website with so much information. So, I mean, they have these cyber weapons. Again, this is this long-term thing. They're also monitoring ASEAN, and that's come out. All these ASEAN countries, China has been monitoring internet traffic there. So the next one is Iran, and I think this is kind of interesting. I mean, Iran is an emerging power in cybersecurity. They have attacked our energy companies, our financial companies, very big on attacking Saudi Aramco for obvious reasons. Saudi Arabia and Iran are enemies, or competitors, I should say. And there's a big Israeli-Iranian cyber competition going on. The Israelis have already said they want to be a cybersecurity superpower, and it's about Iran. So that's the thing. Now the concern is now, if Iran doesn't focus as much on nuclear weapons, and they lift the sanctions, and this is in the best case scenario, they're going to invest all of their resources in cyber attacks. So North Korea. I mean, this kind of goes. This is not a very good picture of the leader of North Korea here. So, I mean, they've always been attacking South Korea. We always think of North Korea as this backwater, prehistoric, for lack of a better word, they have no technology, whatever. But the North Korean army is very well armed in terms of cybersecurity. Actually, they're very well armed, period. They have some of the best air defense weaponry there is, but they also have a very elaborate setup for cybersecurity. Each one of these units that has a very specific job, whether it be attacking foreigners like Sony, attacking South Korea, if there's a war, how they're going to use cyber warfare as part of a greater strategy. So North Korea is a player. ISIS, it's kind of, I know we don't consider ISIS a country, but it's a geography at this point. They're very fluid. I mean, we don't know whether these are lone wolf sympathizers that are doing their attacks, or these Westerners going over there joining them, and we don't know how organized it is. It seems to be the focus is on social media. They did the CENTCOM Twitter attack. They actually attacked in my neck of the woods, the Casino Redevelopment Authority out of Atlantic City. They took over that website, so that came out there. So they're all over. Nothing serious yet, but they're there. Syria. Now this is well, I realize ISIS is in Syria too, but this is more the Assad regime. They've had the Syrian Electronic Army, and I talked about them. They like to deface, but they do have an impact. They actually went after Sheldon Adelson at Sands because he's a big supporter of Israel. To our honorable mention list, I also want to kind of bring up Turkey and Egypt. Now, both are our allies, although Turkey has drifted a lot from the NATO sphere in a lot of ways, investing a lot in cybersecurity, as is Egypt. Egypt still remains fairly close to us, but I'll talk about keeping allies close to us so that they don't use these capabilities against us. But those are two areas. And you got to remember, too, Egypt was a big outsourcing for Europe, so they do have a highly technical workforce there. So what are the similarities? Okay, so I kind of said there's got to be trends here. I remember when I gave this speech in Las Vegas, someone said, all these countries are like the axis of evil. I'm like, well, I don't want to be that high level, but they have a lot of internet surveillance. Look up Enemies of the Internet, Open Net Initiative, a lot of internet surveillance. Now, internet surveillance is not a bad thing. I'm not coming out against that. I mean, we use that to go after child pornographers and drug dealers and all these bad criminals. So we monitor the internet for positive reasons. But all these countries have high-level internet surveillance, a lot of corruption. There's no civil society. I mean, there's no mediating institutions between government and the people. That's the first thing you take down when you have an authoritarian regime is your civil society. They're unliberal or illiberal. They don't have Western values, human rights, things to that effect. There's some sort of hostility or rivalry with the West, and there tend to be state-sponsored cyber groups within those countries. So those are kind of the similarities. I mean, and so when you look at that, almost all of them hit the mark on this. And I said, well, and this is kind of the metric you'd evaluate. And I mean, I view these as future. They're future. They're the present and their future in terms of our cyber enemies. I mean, these are the worst of the worst. I don't see this changing anytime soon. I mean, so what are the big lessons here? Cyber attacks are really a low-cost way of our enemies to attack us. I mean, there's not a lot of retaliation when we're cyber attacked. I think international relations is still important. I mean, there's some sort of relationship between international relations and cybersecurity. I mean, neorealism still exists. We got into the neoliberal model of, well, if we just do free trade all the time, things get better. And I'm not knocking free trade because I'm a big backer of free trade, but that doesn't solve our national security issues. In some ways, it actually can augment them. And that leads to my last point. You can't separate global markets from global rivalries. I think that even I think Alexander Hamilton said that when we started the Republic. So what are the recommendations? Well, I mean, I have three areas of recommendation. One's organizational. Any organization, whether it be the government itself or it be a company, what state and local governments can start doing for their people and the federal government can do. Organizational. you got to get your arms around your organization. You have to know, inventory all the data and processes in your company. I realize that's, if you got a huge company, that's a little bit harder to do. But understand where your data is, where your data processes are. And then understand the hardware and software that supports them. Who has access? Figure out who has access. Now that's, you'd be surprised, the companies that I work with that don't, that, everybody's got access. Everybody's got full access. Well, that's not a good thing. It's always least access, least privilege access possible. Do a risk assessment based on that. Where are the risks? Then come up with your mitigation controls, and that's where you bring the technology in. Then you can start bringing in these security systems and whatnot, because that's, sometimes what we do is we go after a tsetse fly with a sledgehammer with technology. We're going to get this huge security system, cybersecurity system, and it's just too much. And it creates extra work. Now, I mean, make the shoe fit the foot, and then always monitor it. Some other things, and it's kind of what I said, let your analysis drive the technology and even the framework you choose. There's a lot of cybersecurity frameworks out there. ISACA has just come up with a security framework. Again, one size not fit all. Find the framework that works. Remember, everything has a value. Even those medical records, they can jumpstart an industry. Location, location, location. I think that was the point of my previous slides with geography. Know who you're doing business with and be aware of the one-off. And let me give you an example with India. We've got great relations with India. I don't think it's any surprise we outsource a lot of IT to India. India is pretty much a westernized country. I mean, they're not a bad actor. But recently in an article, we found out that China is targeting India in cybersecurity. Well, we're doing business in India and China's targeting them. Well, that's the one-off we really have to be very cognizant of and build that into our risk models. Oops. State and local governments. I hate to use the term public-private partnerships because we use that all the time. That's a big public policy word, public-private partnerships. When in doubt, call something a public-private partnership. But I do believe in a public-private partnership between the government and the private sector to address cybersecurity and build that resiliency. And what you want to do is you want to build awareness, spread best practices, especially for small businesses, and use it as an economic development driver. I want to open up a business in a high-crime area. Why would I open up a business in an area that I know is very vulnerable for in terms of cybersecurity? Get law enforcement involved. I mean, they should be able to do the forensics. They should be able to do all the types of good police work, but in the cyber realm. And education. This is important. Encourage good behavior on the internet. I remember when I gave this speech that the Apple hacking was a big deal. And the celebrities' inappropriate photos got out. And my advice would have been the best way to prevent inappropriate photos from getting out is not taking inappropriate photos in the first place. That's usually the best. Prevention's worth an ounce of cure there. And let's build the next generation of cybersecurity experts. Actually, Israel's doing that. They are very big on, Israeli kids are supposed to be into security the way our kids are into social media. Let's build that next generation of cybersecurity experts. It's kids very excited, and that's a state and local thing. Federal, now this is where the laundry list starts. Okay, a couple things. I do think we need a cybersecurity regulatory regime, and I'm not a big proponent of regulations, but I do think we need something. There's 3 bills before Congress. Finally, Congress is now pushing through 3. There's 2 coming out of the House that passed. They're going to get merged. One's from the House Intel Committee, and one is from the House Homeland Security Committee. There's one in the Senate, I think from the Senate Intel Committee. And actually, I'll talk about another one that I wasn't really thinking of, was Aaron's Law. Basically, what the 3 bills effectively do is they create a regime for threat sharing information and create a safe harbor. So businesses won't get sued if they, if they say, hey, look, we had an attack. They're trying to insulate that. And more importantly, they're creating a mechanism for businesses to share with information with the government so people don't think the government's spying on them and the businesses get in trouble. So it's really an information sharing bill, both of them at its heart. That's why privacy experts are watching it very closely. And it will give teeth to the ISAOs, which I'll talk about at the end. 4th bill is Aaron's Law. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. Well, Aaron's Law basically wants to reform the criminal prosecution of hackers. Okay, so really what we have to do here is we have to evaluate the threat environment. We should rate nations, like we have no travel zones, we should rate nations on cybersecurity. We have to keep our intelligence going. We have, let's keep our partners with us. Let's not try to give them an excuse to go in their own direction, especially ones that are strong in cybersecurity. And the president did start coming out with this. Let's have some, let's build out our non-defense defense relationships. We see that with Britain. We should definitely be working with some of our, Eastern Europe and South Korea, some joint crime and extradition. What we should do is have response options, what the president did say. So, the punishment fits the crime. So if you attack us, this is what happens. Let me jump down. Let's think about cybersecurity with immigration policy too. The H-1B visas. Let's take a step back and make sure that that works. One of the things I want to highlight here is the ISAOs, the Information Security Analysis Organizations, which the president did the executive order, which those bills are going to give the oomph to, is basically groups of companies within an industry, within geography, get together and share threat information and build some sort of resiliency. I think that's a good thing, and I think it'll mean something because we're going to have the bills, Congress will push a bill that supports that. So, the Trans-Pacific Partnership's in the news. These are the countries that are involved in it. A little talk about e-commerce, integrated telecom, a little bit of that could be considered cybersecurity related. As you can see, none of these countries are really, at issue as being hostile to us. But look at their relationships with China. The arrows in means that the country exports to China as the biggest exporter, and the arrow in towards a country means that they're an importer to China. So these countries touch China, which is a problem in terms of cybersecurity. So what's your approach? We've got to be special care with defense information because these are countries we have defense treaties with. Perhaps a collective security or mutual defense agreement with these countries in terms of cybersecurity. Create a cybersecurity umbrella, create law enforcement just so that we can protect resiliency within the TPP. We don't want countries that are taking advantage of TPP then get slammed with a cybersecurity incident. Also, we have to consider this China-centric FTA that was being talked about. Do we isolate ourselves or cybersecurity exposure? What I would do is I just fast-track the TPP and beat China to the FTA. We should have some sort of alliance within FTA, and the private sector has to remain vigilant. Private companies, look at your supply chains. Do a risk assessment of your supply chains. If you have to put higher premiums on various things, build that into your cost-benefit analysis. So let me conclude with this. This is what Kissinger said in his new book, it's just fantastic. Everybody should read it. Economic globalization, in its essence, ignores national frontiers. Foreign policy affirms them, even as it seeks to reconcile conflicting national aims or ideals of world order. I would sit there and say we can sit there and substitute out the internet for economic globalization, and we can substitute cybersecurity for foreign policy and get the same gist of it. At the end of you guys can look this up. These are just some of the sources I've used, and I put them in here as a way, if you want to learn more about cybersecurity, these are all these newsletters I get that give great cybersecurity updates. I'm sure that the speakers have their own list, but these are ones I follow almost every day. I try to read them, and I highly advise, if you're interested in cybersecurity, keep looking at that. So I'll open up the questions. MSSAC it's Municipal Security Information Systems Analysis Council. If you just Google it, you can get it. And what that is, it's geared towards municipal governments. Unless you're with a municipal government, you can't actually join, but you call them up and they'll put you on the email list, which they did for me. And it's great. I mean, that is like a laundry list of different, they'll say, hey, this was a vulnerability we found. This is what you do. This is a high-risk vulnerability for a small enterprise. It's great. I mean,
Are you familiar with the FSISAC?
yes. These are all kind of under the same umbrella.
Impressions about FSISAC?
They don't have a newsletter like this one does. That's what I did. But you know what though? Actually, this is pretty good for everybody because they talk about Adobe and Microsoft, things everybody uses. So I mean, this is a good basic thing. The FSISAC is great though, but they don't have this, their newsletter isn't as user friendly as MSISAC's. Any other questions? Yep.
Should I give my name? Sean Egan from Egan Jones Rating Company. The question that I have two questions actually. One is, can you address these standards that are evolving and whether or not they're very helpful? And then a comment on the some of the positions of the major firms within the cybersecurity space beyond IBM.
Okay, in terms of the different frameworks, I think every framework has its merits.
Right.
I mean, I'm focusing a little bit on the ISACA one. I'm starting to, they just published it, so I'm still trying to learn it. I think the problem, and I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I truly is, I think the problem is we try to implement these frameworks carte blanche. And then we create a lot of noise, just, well, did you comply with this, did you comply with that? And we don't take a risk-based approach. I think you always have to look at a risk-based approach, look at what your risks are, then pick the framework that addresses those risks. And I'm not trying to dance around the question, I tell everyone that. I mean, I know, like, I'm sure anyone's, IBM's or Facebook's or whoever, they're all built around some of the same concepts. A lot of it's built around NIST. I mean, NIST is very, very basic, and almost all of these frameworks have you could see the DNA of NIST in there, but they're all built around NIST. And, but you got to make sure it applies. It just gets more deep. It takes NIST a step further. Now the question is, do you as a company have to take a step further? Okay, what are the other firms doing? I think Apple, I'm going to pick on Apple a little bit, it's a great company. I think that they're doing a lot because Apple was always the cornerstone of it's the most secure system out there. It's the most secure system that everybody says, oh, Apple can't be hacked. But now we're starting to, now if you read that MSISAC, you see that they're getting all the vulnerabilities are getting published more with Apple. So if Apple was always the gold standard, they're taking things seriously too.
That is really the consulting firms, the firms that are consulting to the companies as opposed to the companies themselves.
Yeah, I can't, I mean, I think that everyone's taking it seriously. I don't really know what's going on in the inner workings of what FireEye is doing and Mandy and those guys. I use their material though. I mean, FireEye publishes some great material. Mandy publishes Acme. They all publish some great material. I mean, I enjoy their reports. What they're telling their customers, that I'm not really sure about. What they're telling their individual customers.
Well,
Anything?
we want to thank you very
Great,
much.
thanks so much. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And I thought that my name is unpronounceable and difficult to pronounce, but the next speaker really has a difficult name for me to pronounce, but I will attempt. It's Professor Andrea Matwashi, I guess. Is it something like that? Okay, whatever. Well, I want to thank you for coming. The next speaker is really an expert on the legal implications for the innovation of information technology. She's a professor, Microsoft visiting professor at the Center of Technology, Information Technology Policy at Princeton University. And she holds various appointments around the United States, in Stanford, Oxford, and many other places, but also at next door at Wharton School of Business, not at Drexel University, but it's okay. And she really has testified in front of the Congress on issues related to information security regulations, and is frequently quoted by both U.S. and international media organizations on matters related to information technology, security breaches, and cybersecurity. Andrea, please join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to join you today. Picking up on some of the important themes that were mentioned in the last session, I'll try to highlight some of the current events going on in DC and current events going on in the private sector from my perspective and the trends that we're seeing in information security. But I'll start with raising 2 questions with the audience, and then offer a few thoughts on how we might address some of these issues. And I'll try to speak for a limited amount of time so that we can open up to questions, because I think that's sometimes the most interesting and productive part of a meeting of interested parties such as this. So just to give you a bit of my background, I started in this space kind of unexpectedly. I was a practicing attorney in the first tech boom, and it was really my clients that pulled me into information security issues. First, it was big technology clients, and then it ended up being the financial sector and the banking clients that I worked with, who were facing, among other things, insider threats and employees walking out with portfolios of high-value clients, and it was the Wild West back then in terms of the absence of data breach laws, the absence of a widespread concern over identity theft. It was a different regulatory and policy framework in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so it was that client-based experience that really got me engaged in this space. And this space has progressed tremendously during the last 10, 12, 15 years or so. And so having watched that progression, I'd like to highlight 2 trends and ask some perhaps slightly provocative questions. So the first question that I'd like to pose to the group and have us contemplate is whether we're getting our terminology right. So in DC and in probably the common vernacular, we use this term of cybersecurity, but you'll notice that I didn't just now, right? I say information security or computer security. And so the reason for that, and this is something that is shared in the way that not only I speak about it, but that many of the old guard of the technologists speak about this. There's a concern that I think we share that by slapping a cyber on the front of something, you sort of put a little bow on it rather than unpacking the bigger problem. So for the most part, security breaches don't just happen because there was something bad on the internet. It's a connected set of problems that exist inside organizations, whether they be private sector or public sector, that involve not only the technical elements, but also the human elements. So let's look at some of the I don't want to pick on anyone, but take a look at the Chelsea Bradley Manning leak of information. That was a physical insertion of a thumb drive into a machine, right? There was nothing really internet connected about that kind of an attack. Or recently, just over the weekend, Tesla had a challenge when someone engaged with AT&T's support, and the result was that Elon Musk's and Tesla's Twitter account was compromised and a few other ramifications like that. So it's not just the technical piece, it's also the human piece. And so looking at security as this holistic interaction of physical measures alongside technology measures, it's absolutely essential, because otherwise even the best laid plans will result in, as one of my Google engineer friends once said, the worst crisis management is engineers running down the hall screaming. That's bad incident response. And yet that does happen still, unfortunately, frequently when the risk management isn't put in place and processes aren't contemplated in advance. So that's my first question to the group. Are we talking about these issues in a way that is consonant across the public sector, the private sector, and across the technology expertise and the policy expertise and the risk management expertise? The second question that I'd pose to the group and ask us to think about is whether we're viewing these problems in a static lens or in a dynamic lens. So something that I've written a bit about is this, I call it the Red Queen effect, and I'm making a reference to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, where there's the Red Queen, and at some point the dialogue is something like, we have to run really fast just to stay in place. And when you have a situation where the attackers are incredibly sophisticated and on par with the expertise that you bring to the table, which is the case in our problem set here with information security, you have this need to analyze things not only for today, but also for 5 years, 10 years, et cetera. So the question that I'd pose to our group is whether our legal structures, our management structures are set up with that long-term perspective. When we have a situation where frequently, and understandably, I know why, companies prioritize quarterly returns, the bottom line, the return rate on this initiative versus this other initiative, it's not always obvious to the financial analysts inside companies the value proposition in investing in security. Because much like the situation with legal risk, you're trying to demonstrate a negative, right? You're trying to demonstrate that the trade secrets weren't stolen, that the customer trust wasn't eroded. And that presents a challenge in the way that we're framing the conversation. So how do we best address this Red Queen effect? That's something I'd like to ask the group to consider. And let me offer a few thoughts on what I see for the future and fill you in on a little bit of what's going on in DC from my perspective, and then we can open it up to questions and discussion, because I think that would be particularly interesting. So the first theme that I'd like to offer for us to consider when we are debating these issues, revamping our enterprises, or trying to create policy initiatives is a question of what I call technology suitability. So, and I'm borrowing shamelessly from securities regulation here. So when we're building technologies, or when we're structuring our enterprises, or choosing which new processes to implement, are we picking the fanciest, newest, most flashy, blinky light thing, or are we picking the best method to accomplish the goal, which may involve using a lower technology solution? For example, our nuclear power plants really shouldn't be online. We don't need to have them online. If an engineer can operate a nuclear power plant from an iPad sitting on a sofa, that may be more risk than we're willing to absorb. Maybe it makes sense for certain systems to not be connected. We used to have these air gaps in place in earlier iterations of, for example, our infrastructure, but there's been this creep of what I call the better with bacon problem. You know how some restaurants will sprinkle bacon on everything and suddenly it's a great new meal because it's got bacon on it and it's fancier that way, or so the story goes. This is too high stakes a situation to have this better with bacon problem. Sometimes less is more. Sometimes less technology is more. Sometimes an older system may be more desirable for a certain property for a particular situation. So that's the technology suitability question. A modern example, so one of the security researchers that I follow on Twitter recently posted a tweet that was a screenshot from Shodan. And Shodan is this very scary place. It is a search engine where vulnerable items are listed. And so you can run a query on Shodan for kidney dialysis machine, and you will get a list of various kidney dialysis machines that are talking to the internet at that time in a way that's vulnerable, and so an attacker could easily compromise them. That's Shodan. It's like the Google of vulnerable things. It's not good. And so he posts this tweet, and it is a toaster. There are now toasters connected to the internet. I'm not sure why I need an internet-connected toaster, but it's vaguely concerning to me that my toaster settings could be manipulated through the internet, because toasters have things like heating coils in them. And if I turn off my toaster, I want it to stay off. So, you know, maybe someone really wants that internet-connected toaster, but is it a market situation that we're creeping toward a world where the not internet-connected toaster will no longer be available because the only things that are produced are these better with bacon internet-connected toasters? And that's not necessarily a safer world or a more desirable one for either companies or consumers, because there's a consumer desire that won't be optimally met if we phase out the lower technology product. And the safety questions around vulnerabilities are obviously omnipresent, particularly when I can see that there are toasters on Shodan that are vulnerable to attack. So that's the technology suitability question. The next point, the theme that I'll raise with the group, is the idea of what I call reciprocal security inducement. So we tend to think about the private sector doing this, the public sector doing this, and then throwing missives at each other periodically about the state of information security in one or the other. But the goal for us, I would posit, is to have both the public and the private sector look inside and try to lead by example. And so, unfortunately, when you look at the history of data breaches in both the public sector and the private sector, you see that we're not quite there yet. And there's room for companies, agencies, organizations to start at home and conduct thorough audits before perhaps vociferously advocating certain approaches to information security. I think this is a great opportunity for organizations to lead by example. And let me give you just a quick standards-based example. So as many of you undoubtedly know, there are two ISO standards around information security now, ISO 30111 and ISO 29147. And these two standards provide for rudimentary processes in place in organizations with respect to the way that they intake and process information about security vulnerabilities that exist in their products or services or operations. And so a quick check that someone, for example, such as I, might run, one of the basic requirements of these ISO standards is that every company have an easy, visible front door for reporting security problems. Because even though good companies have bug bounty programs, they try really hard with elite security teams to find all the mistakes in their products and services, sometimes accidental discovery happens by a customer, or a security researcher is trying to make a product interoperate with another product. Sometimes that security researcher works at a competing company. For example, many vulnerabilities are reported to Microsoft by Google employees. This is the dynamic marketplace that we are in. So when a company has this easily available front door for reporting of vulnerabilities, it says to me, and this should be visible on the website because that's the logical point of entry and that's what the ISO standards suggest. It says to me, this is a company that cares about security. And if I go to that website and I can't find any discussion of security, I can't find an easy place for reporting a vulnerability, it makes me take a step back and wonder if the company has yet had those hard conversations inside to develop adequate processes to handle vulnerability intake and patching and pushing out of fixes in the sophisticated way that the most elite companies have at this point. So that's one of those little tells that can demonstrate which companies are potentially easier targets for compromise. If an attacker has a sense that a company is that zebra sprinting at the front of the pack and is not the limping zebra in the back of the pack in terms of information security, the attacker will decide that's annoying and move on, because every company and every enterprise can be compromised. It's just a question of how long it will take. If you're the fastest zebra, it's going to be a lot harder to take you down. But if you project perhaps being less sophisticated in these matters, that creates an impression of an easier target. So whether that is true in a public sector entity or a private sector entity, there are these internal reviews, audits, third-party audits, penetration testing, these basic mechanisms that have not yet been fully implemented inside most organizations, unfortunately. And this becomes particularly important when we are entering this Internet of Things era where we have the connected toasters, and particularly companies that are not traditionally technology companies, they face formidable challenges in getting themselves up to speed. And that's where something like the ISO standards can really be a useful touchstone for updating processes in this way. So that's my point on reciprocal security. The last point that I'll raise with the group and talk a little bit about legislative dynamics that I'm seeing in DC, and then open it up to questions, if there are any, which I hope there are, is the question of security by design. And so traditionally, when products have been built, even at sophisticated companies, the degree to which the information integrity and security of the product has been built in from the beginning, from the ground floor up, it hasn't always been ideal. So security is sometimes not one of those checklist items that exists on the most basic, the important list of engineering specifications and requirements. Security and legal have frequently been left sort of toward the end as that check mark, that sign off, rather than something that existed in the whole life cycle of the product. Now, depending on the kind of lawyer that you're working with, you may not want the lawyer involved in the build of your product fully, though if you have a cooperative lawyer, there is a room for a useful partnership. But security really needs to be there. When you build a product in a way that does not contemplate security from the ground up, you have a reverse fitting problem. You have legacy problems that won't necessarily allow you to retrofit those security measures to make the product at the end of the day be as secure as you'd like it to be and as you need it to be for your customers, your business partners, and the marketplace. And particularly, so I'm not sure if this was in my bio, I served as the senior policy advisor to the Federal Trade Commission last year. And so this Federal Trade Commission is certainly engaged with this notion of whether companies are incorporating security by design and looking at whether reasonable security measures are in place throughout the organization, and when something like a large-scale data breach happens, whether that was the result of this deficit of security by design in both the organizational structure and in the products themselves. And so that is the next generation of policy framing that I think is coming out of the agencies and DC, this notion of security by design inside corporate structures and inside products. So with that, let me briefly just discuss three regulatory, actually more statutory, congressional conversations that are happening currently. Well, one is at the Copyright Office. I'll start there. So perhaps the most important policy problem from my perspective that we face is this question of striking a balance between having measures in place to punish malicious attackers without gutting the next generation of our information security professionals. And frequently, the two become inefficiently intertwined. For example, one of the proposals that we've seen in DC involves eliminating the possibility of a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act violation, and that's the primary computer intrusion statute in the US, eliminating the possibility that a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act violation would be a misdemeanor. Well, on the surface, that may hold superficial appeal. It's trying to demonstrate taking computer intruders seriously, and certainly the most egregious attackers need to be dealt with seriously. But once we start unpacking that a little bit, by eliminating misdemeanor computer intrusion, it means that the 14-year-old or the 16-year-old who is tinkering with something or decides to play a prank on his teacher in school and changes a screensaver or a background picture, and in that way exceeds authorized access on that machine, instead of being sanctioned by the school, the parents, maybe given some community service to fix some, nursing home websites or something, to do some social good, instead of rechanneling those computer skills toward a socially productive avenue, that teenager will suddenly be branded potentially a felon because the misdemeanor option's removed. And when you talk to the professionals in this space, they all were that teenager. They were tinkerers. They were pushing the boundaries of the technologies they had in their hands in the 80s and 90s. But the difference back then was that our technology wasn't monitoring our conduct to the same extent, and the laws were not as aggressive as they are now. So the cautionary note that I'm trying to convey here is that in the name of aggressive prosecution of intruders, there's a very serious innovation policy concern about building our own domestic skilled workforce and a generation of entrepreneurs in some of the tinkering behaviors that might be swept in with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and other laws to that extent. If you look at the conduct of, and they admit to this, if you look at the conduct of Bill Gates, of Steve Jobs, of Mark Zuckerberg, each of their tinkering in college, high school, et cetera, each of that developmental self-evolution that they describe, today, it could be framed as potentially felonious Computer Fraud and Abuse Act conduct if it had happened today. But it didn't, and it was a different time and a different atmosphere. And so this is part of the framing that we need to be cautious about when we're talking about particularly limiting the bottom set of penalties for computer intruders. And so some of the CFAA approaches in Congress take that very aggressive approach. Some of the proposals in Congress take a less aggressive approach, and that's one of the cuts to look for when you're reviewing bills that are before Congress. Did you have a point? Okay. So two more items that I'll mention to you. The second is that for many years now there have been data breach notification harmonization bills coming through Congress, and those basically have moving pieces involving, on the one hand, creating a floor of reporting to eliminate the legitimate transaction cost that businesses have of filing in 46 plus jurisdictions when they experience a data breach. But another piece of this is perhaps an overzealous elimination of any liability in some of these proposals for data breach related conduct that may have led up to this breach. And that creates a set of issues where the companies in the marketplace who are engaging in the most rigorous information security conduct may get penalized for their investments rather than rewarded for their investments. And so it's not clear that liability limitation is the way we want to go. But the last piece that I'll mention to you, and it's something that I'm personally involved with, and so hence I find it fascinating. So in addition to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which governs authorized access to code, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is an intellectual property statute, a copyright statute, which prohibits the circumvention of any digital copy protection device. And what this involves for security researchers is that they may violate this IP statute as they're trying to verify whether the underlying code is safe for consumer or corporate use. And so what's resulted is that our medical devices, our computer code, our Internet of Things connected gadgets, cars, etc., are having only a limited portion of their code base reviewed by impartial third parties, and our agencies haven't yet evolved to the point of creating pathways for verifying the integrity of the code. The FDA does not independently test our medical devices. And for example, the copy protection measures limit up to, researchers tell me, approximately 40% of the code in these devices is not testable by them because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So every 3 years, the Copyright Office has a rulemaking proceeding, and it's going on right now, and by this Friday, I have a last round filing due. I'm the lawyer on behalf of a group of computer security academics, 2 from University of Pennsylvania, 1 from Princeton, 1 from Michigan, and 1 from Columbia. And we're seeking an exemption that allows for the testing of this code behind these copy protection measures for the purpose of testing its safety. So there's no risk of copying here. It's just to test that safety. But yet, research isn't being done because of this fear of the legal stick of the DMCA, in much the same way that researchers are concerned about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act stick. Now, the downside is that if friendly researchers don't test and report to companies that are receptive to these reports, the consequence will be a burgeoning black market or gray market, because the legality hasn't yet been fully determined, of these exploits being sold through intermediaries, and these intermediaries aren't always U.S. citizens and don't necessarily have allegiance to the United States. So taking these holistic approaches to keeping our vulnerabilities inside our own country and having companies process them and our agencies process them in a receptive way is the first step toward a more secure national defense. And I'll leave you with that thought and happy to take questions.
A few questions because, yes, go ahead.
Please.
Thank you. Dr. Matlerson, thank you very much. My first question is, what is the FTC going to do that the SEC hasn't done?
So it's two completely different regulatory bases. The Federal Trade Commission's authority comes out of Section 5 of the FTCA, which deals with unfair trade practices and conduct that is fraudulent, for example, and it's a marketing connected set of authorizations in some ways, though they have also gone after other representations of security where there's a deficit of reasonable security. So that is the marketplace as a whole. The Securities and Exchange Commission deals only with publicly traded companies on these issues. In October of 2011, the Securities and Exchange Commission put out guidance for reporting of cybersecurity incidents. It actually mirrored the recommendations that I had made several years before in an article, so I'm happy to talk about that at length. And the SEC has mentioned in subsequent statements that they're not necessarily thrilled with the degree of disclosure that's happening. So as a consequence, we have I think, correct approach by the SEC in terms of asking the market to absorb and getting for the market more information about handling of internal processes. But unfortunately, that's targeted at public companies. The FTC's approach is all consumer-facing products, contemplating, of course, competition elements as well. But it's a slightly different regulatory authorization. But they're working in tandem. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have a second question. This code review.
Mm-hmm.
Is this code review to understand if the code is secure? Because there aren't a lot of really expert people that can do that.
Exactly. So that is part of the challenge, and that when you have a small group of highly skilled individuals, it becomes difficult for companies, particularly startups, to be able to, A, afford, B, find people with that level of sophistication and skill to give them that top tier kind of security review. And that's particularly why it's important to have an open door policy to vulnerability reporting. If you put a product out into the marketplace and you've done your best and you've tried to catch the errors, but you are recognizing that you don't have the Google security team at your disposal to check your products, then it makes sense from a risk management standpoint, from a marketplace trust standpoint, and from a legal liability limitation standpoint to welcome external reports improve your product, iterate it, and realize that it's everyone's goal to have a more secure marketplace.
We want to thank you very much.
Thanks.
This is living to teach at Princeton, and we thank you very much. Our next speaker is a colleague from Drexel, Rob Dovidio, who serves as a professor in the Department of Criminology and Justice in the College of Arts and Sciences, as an associate dean as well of the College of Arts and Sciences. He's an expert on matters related to the computer crime, digital investigations, and computer security. And he has been involved in various activities, research projects, and his bio is written here in the program. But I want to bring to your attention that the fact that Rob sits on the Computer Crime and Digital Evidence Committee of the International Association of the Chiefs of Police, and he provides regular commentary for media outlets on and news stories pertaining to computer crime. Please welcome Rob.
Thank you, George. I will begin first by thanking the organizing committee for asking me to speak this morning. When told that the conference theme was cybersecurity in a globally integrated world, I felt that breach notification laws and the connection to identity theft protection would be a fitting topic to speak on. Before I move on, I first want to mention that the research I'm going to speak about today was supported by a grant from the National Institute of Justice. I also want to recognize my colleague, Dr. Murugan Andarajan from LeBeau's College of Business at Drexel, as my collaborator on the work that I'm going to present and speak on today. So we need to look no further than the daily news headlines to tell that we have a computer security problem here in the United States and across the globe. Headlines such as 1.7 million Connecticut residents impacted by the Anthem data breach and 2.3 million Americans suffer medical identity theft speak to the magnitude of the cybersecurity problem and billions of dollars in annual losses to breached organizations and the people whose identities were compromised. Before I move on to discuss the role of breach notification legislation in preventing identity theft, it's important that I briefly talk about the crime of identity theft and how it has evolved over the past 30 years or so. Computer technologies, including the internet, mobile computing devices, persistent high-speed network connectivity, electronic commerce services that are targeted at consumers, and storage and analytical capabilities that led to the commodification of information have both complicated and simplified the crime of identity theft. Since the introduction of these technologies, we have seen identity theft move from a crime where a person steals identifiers belonging to one or a few people directly from them, and then subsequently uses these identifiers for fraudulent purposes, to a crime that involves many criminals and task specialization. We now have a complex network of criminal actors and entities involved with identity theft that includes organized enterprises that target massive data troves to expose thousands of people in a single instance, a commerce infrastructure through which stolen identifiers are brokered with the protection of technologies such as cryptocurrencies and onion routing. And finally, the people who purchase the stolen identifiers to commit some sort of fraud. And the complications don't stop at this change in the criminal network involved in identity theft. The types of identity fraud are growing. We still have plenty of traditional fraud connected to the use of stolen or duplicated credit cards, but we're seeing increases in employment fraud where people are working under someone else's name and skirting their tax liabilities. and health insurance fraud where people are getting involved or getting medical services while presenting insurance information belonging to someone else. And these are just a few of the types of identity-related fraud that we're seeing emerge at increasing rates in the marketplace. So on one hand, we have identity theft being a more complicated crime because of task specialization involved in the various stages of the criminal act. But on the other hand, identity theft has been simplified because the currency of the crime, namely the stolen identifiers used to commit some sort of fraud, are much easier to acquire in massive quantities. So take, for example, the 2014 Premier Blue Cross data breach. The financial and medical records for 11 million customers were stolen through a breach in Premier's computer network by a group in China. So if not for anything else, downloading 11 million records from a central database while sitting in the comfort of your home 6,000 miles away from the server where the records are stored is so much easier than executing a plan to travel from China to Washington State, to break into a secured office building, to photocopy 11 million pieces of paper, and then subsequently walk out the door with those 11 million photocopied forms. So I think you all get the point. Methodologies and techniques of crime do matter when it comes to successfully executing crime and preventing victimization. And as a criminologist, I'm not the first person to say this, and I certainly will not be the last. So when the primary sources of stolen identifiers change during the evolution of identity theft from the person who the identifiers belong to some third-party entity who may or may not have a direct business relationship with the person who the identifiers belong to, awareness of victimization went down. Now, let me note here that when I say victimization, I'm talking about the person whose identifying data have been stolen. I do care, but not to the extent that I do care about the organization that suffered the breach, but not to you and I, the poor individuals who are often left holding the unprotected because of the breach, right? So the victim of identity theft here certainly loses an element of control that must more than ever rely on a third-party entity who held the identity data to come forward and notify owners that they can cancel affiliated accounts, change passwords, and put in place the protective measures such as credit freezes or credit blocks to prevent identity theft and stolen identifiers from being used for some sort of fraud. Now, all would be good and rosy if we could rely on organizations that hold identity data belonging to employees, customers, and the general public to come forward in an expeditious manner to inform the owners of the data that a breach occurred and that they are at increased risk of some sort of identity fraud. So in terms of criminological theory, I'm saying that organizations suffering data breaches need to play the role of capable guardian and tell people whose identity data have been compromised in order to prevent identity theft. And because crime, according to routine activities theory, occurs when one or more people who are motivated to commit a crime encounter suitable targets for victimization in an environment that's devoid of a capable guardian. So it's the guardian really who serves as the impetus to put in motion the preventative steps that render the stolen identity data useless in terms of committing fraud. Now, unfortunately, from the Computer Security Institute, we can draw some conclusions about whether organizations are being capable guardians. Data from the Computer Security Institute examining actions taken in response to network security incidents show that organizations suffering a breach in identity data are not playing this role of capable guardian against identity theft. In 2008, 2009, and 2010, for example, only 27%, 35%, and 25 or 27.5% of organizations, respectively, reported network security incidents to law enforcement agencies. Though more alarming is the lack of reporting by these organizations directly to the people who had identity data compromised. In 2009 and 2010, only 22% and 18.1% of organizations notified the owners of the data about the compromise. And the story these data tell is by no means limited to the years mentioned. The lack of reporting by organizations suffering security incidents and data breaches dates back to even prior to the turn of the century. So fortunately for consumers, state governments in the United States have recognized that the selfish behavior of organizations to keep data breaches quiet certainly disadvantages consumers and the general public when it comes to safeguarding their identities and preventing identity theft. So as such, we have seen the enactment of state laws that mandate organizations suffering a security breach involving identity data notify the owners of the data about the compromise. So to me and my collaborator, the enactment of these laws represents the government saying to organizations that your past actions, or more appropriately, inactions, show that you cannot be relied upon to be good stewards of identity data. These notification laws, through forcing the hands of an organization that experiences a data breach, become the capable guardians to protect employees, consumers, and the general public against identity theft in an age when data are a commodity and big data generate these extreme values. So in 2002, California became the first state to mandate notification following security breach, a security breach of identity data. And since then, we've seen 47 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands all enact mandatory notification statutes. As of January 1st of this year, Alabama, New Mexico, and South Dakota are the only states in the U.S. that do not presently have some sort of mandatory breach notification law on the books. Though unfortunately for consumers, not all breach notification statutes are created equally, and not all of them have what I would call legal teeth. Some laws are better at protecting consumers than others when it comes to identity theft victimization. So my colleague, Dr. Antarajan, and I set out to compare state data breach notification statutes to see which states provided its citizens with the best protection against identity theft. And we also examined whether the state can serve as a capable guardian against identity theft through the enactment of these notification laws. So to compare laws, we created this, what we call the Data Breach Notification Statute Index. So the index is made up of 53 items across 5 equally weighted dimensions. The first dimension deals with how a security breach is defined under the law. So it essentially gets at the requirement for how the data must be stored in order for the law to consider an incident a breach. So the less stringent the storage requirements, the higher the dimension score for this first dimension. The second dimension defines the types of consumer data that, when affected, compromise a breach of security. So you'll find that some states require a string of specific data types to be exposed, and other states only require a few specific data types to be exposed in order for the incident to be considered a breach. So statutes with, what we say are statutes with general data type requirements, as opposed to a statute requiring a string of specific identity data elements, will score higher on this dimension. Our third dimension sets out to look at the content that needs to be included in the notification to those people whose identity data were compromised. So, for example, some states require that organizations tell affected consumers the date of the breach and how the breach occurred, and then subsequently provide consumers with a contact phone number so further inquiry can be made. So we say the more details in a notification about the breach and the steps that consumers can take to mitigate any sort of threat to victimization, the higher the statute scores on this particular dimension in terms of protecting consumers. Our fourth dimension gets out the methods by which an organization must use to contact the people whose data have been compromised when being notified about the breach. Some states will require a direct form of contact, and some states specify which forms of contact are acceptable and not acceptable. Other states require or allow for less personal forms of contact, such as a public service announcement or an ad in a telephone. So not all states are requiring a personal or directed letter or a phone call by a bank or the company that suffered the breach. So we say requiring direct forms of contact that are personal, like a phone call or a written letter, will result in a higher dimension score, namely that it's going to provide increased protection, more awareness of the event. And then lastly, the fifth dimension that we use to analyze these statutes gets at the penalties suffered by organizations that fail to notify consumers when required under the law to do so, and the legal recourse individuals have against the organization when they are not notified. So obviously deterrence plays an important role here, and the stiffer the penalties and the ability of people to take direct legal action against an organization that fails to notify them of a breach, the higher the score on this dimension will be. So what we did was we took as I said, a cumulative, this was a cumulative index of 53 items that got at measures across these 5 dimensions, and we ranked each statute based on its overall equally weighted dimension index score. And each statute was ranked as either weak, moderate, or strong in terms of guardianship against identity theft. I'll briefly summarize our findings here, given the limited time that we have. But 25 states were classified as weak. 22 states and Washington, D.C. were classified as moderate in terms of guardianship. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware were included in this moderate category. And lastly, only 4 states were classified as strong. These were Montana, Indiana, Maryland, and North Carolina. North Carolina having the highest guardianship index score. So we then went on to examine the state's ability to be a capable guardian against identity theft by the enactment of these mandatory notification statutes. So notification of a breach should serve as a trigger, we say, it should serve as a trigger to consumers to begin employing these crime prevention techniques to reduce the risk of identity theft. So prevention efforts should start with an official complaint being filed with law enforcement or some centralized source like the Federal Trade Commission's Identity Theft Clearinghouse. So as such, we hypothesized that we would see an increase in identity theft complaints and fraud complaints made in a state after a mandatory breach notification law was put in place. But then we also hypothesized that the law would trigger notifications and result in an increase in reported breaches in a state after the law was enacted. And I will note that we controlled for changes in the number of organizations that set up shop in a state for this analysis. So our research shows statistically significant increases after the enactment of a state breach notification law in the number of fraud complaints made by consumers in the state, the number of identity theft complaints made by consumers in the state, and the ratio of reported breaches in the state to the number of organizations in the state. So these results do support the notion that the state can serve as a capable guardian against identity theft through the enactment of these data breach notification laws. We do recognize that the notification following a breach is challenging to any organization for a number of reasons. I mean, the fact that there are 47 states that have different statutes in and of itself is challenging. The direct cost of notification alone is, I'm sure, enough to keep a CIO and a CFO up at night. And this is not to mention the negative impact on revenue and consumer confidence in a brand after a breach is announced. But knowing what we know today about the online markets for stolen identity data, organizations must recognize that they have a moral responsibility to alert people whose identity data are compromised in a network breach, irregardless of what the law says. Quick action on the part of the consumer will certainly go a long way in reducing risk for victimization. So in closing, I would like to briefly mention the other work Dr. Andarajan and I are doing on data breach notification. We've looked at the notification content that is sent after a breach and the reaction of consumers to the content to understand how organizations should craft the notification in order to minimize any ill feelings consumers have toward the brand as a result of the breach. So our hope here is that organizations will increasingly report data breaches if they can minimize any negative feelings that consumers may have from their identity data being compromised. So as in closing, as an FYI, our data show that an apology goes a long way with consumers when their data have been compromised, which certainly runs counter to what many legal advisors in an organization would say that you're allowed to do. But if we, consumers, it's sort of a sign to us as a shift in sort of their thinking that it's not a matter of if I'm going to get one of these letters, it's a matter of when I'm going to get one of these letters. So at this point, I will quiet up and open the floor for a few questions. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts about the national data breach?
I mean, it's certainly something that's necessary. I can tell you when I speak to, chief information security officers and corporate lawyers about their responsibilities under breach notification, they just want to pull their hair out. And, they know that they were slow in acting and they, that's the reason why the government has shoved these laws down their throats, right? They needed to protect the consumers. They needed to play that role of guardianship. But dealing with a hodgepodge of laws and not knowing how to respond in one state when they're used to responding in a particular state is particularly troubling. So, my feeling is that the federal government has been too slow to act, right? And, if we want to increase compliance with reporting, we need to make it much easier. And having this federal standard that usurps all state standards, which is the direction that we're going, certainly makes sense. Unfortunately, the latest bill that was, put forward at the end of March, I believe, really would not be on par with North Carolina or any of those statutes or states that we rank as strong in protecting consumers. And I believe the previous speaker mentioned that, the current trend or thinking is to reduce the liability of organizations. But, I certainly come down on the side of consumer protection. And my philosophy is, if you're an organization making money off of my data, off of my identity, then you better well be prepared to protect it and invest in that protection. And if you can't, there has to be some liability in order to put us on an equal playing field. Yes?
I'd like to suggest a different approach to this. As I sit here, I listen to the police approach to this and an apologetic approach to this. Everybody's got this kind of problem. Everybody better look out. There's nothing we can do about it. What this needs is the image that a good programmer doesn't leave holes. If you leave a hole in your program, you're out of here in 5 minutes. We want winners. We want good people. We want the varsity. And it doesn't have to be perfect either. It's quite clear that if you buy an Apple machine, it's unlikely that you will be invaded. If you buy Microsoft, they're so incompetent you can't stand it. Now that kind of pressure, seems to me, is an image that is easily created. And it's probably more workable and more effective than the red tape approach.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly see where you're coming from. I mean, there is, these statutes are merely Band-Aids, right? They're reactions to a problem. They're not targeting the underlying problem, right? Even with levying penalties for failure to notify, you're not levying them at the people who are insulated against liability because you're buying their software. So, I levy them at a XYZ bank who happens to be using a Microsoft platform for its that was breached. Microsoft isn't going to be held responsible. I mean, they're indemnified through their licensing. So, there's certainly merit to what you're saying. I'd like to think our approach to this is not so much a policing philosophy as more of a consumer protection approach. We're certainly, my colleague and I are certainly coming down on the side of the consumer in terms of this problem, right? It's unconscionable that very few organizations report these data. And when you look at why they're not reporting, it's for things like the concern of the stock price, the concern of reasons why they think competitors would use it to their advantage. And that may be true, but it doesn't usurp their responsibility to the end of the day to you and I, especially when there are many instances where we don't even have a direct business relationship with an organization. We haven't given them authority to hold and retain our data. They've purchased it from other places, and that goes into a whole other area can lead into a whole other area of discussion of responsibility and liability in terms of this whole data brokering movement. But I certainly think that organizations need to recognize that, they can't rely on the government to do this. The government has stepped up forward and slapped them on the wrist by creating these laws because they can't be trusted. And my concern is for you and I is that the laws are only going to get more draconian if industry doesn't meet its obligations.
Well, my response to that is protecting incompetence. Incompetence should be punished.
But how are we protecting incompetence by saying we create a body of laws that are going to hold people responsible if they don't allow us?
Look at this last insurance exchange business for the government health insurance.
All right.
Those people should have been fired, deposited
All right.
in jail.
I get what you're saying. So,
That does absolutely nothing for you if you put some coder in jail.
right. No, I get what you're saying in the sense of the penalties that right. And I don't think notification statutes are the way to go with levying those sort of penalties and holding organizations responsible. There's another way to go in terms of standards, but I think we'll move on because this is a debate that we could sit here the rest of the day and have.
Is there a central depository for breaches?
We've relied on a number of sources. The Identity Theft Clearinghouse seems to be the most comprehensive. Verizon just issued its 2015 breach report. I don't know if anybody get a chance to see it yet, but it's a pretty limited subset of organizations. I mean, the data are just mind-blowing in terms of the number of breached records last year alone, and the costs of those breaches to us, over $400 million in losses. And, that's even up for debate on how we quantify that, but that does include fines that are levied against organizations that are, found to be liable for under a notification statute or under some other regulatory regime. Could we have one last question? Yes.
I wanted to ask, why do you think Montana, Indiana, Maryland, and North Carolina ended up with having the highest scores on stewardship?
That's a good question. We did not get the opportunity to go back and look at testimony on the floor of the state houses when they were debating those statutes. But that's something that we do plan to do, especially what our goal here is to take this and use this as this piece as another piece we're doing on, sort of model what the federal law should look like. I don't believe the current federal law will pass. I think we're still a few rounds away from that, but we do need to look at the testimony at the state in the state houses to really get at the impetus behind having stronger legislation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.